Hi, Mary. How are you?
I'm well. I'm well. How are you, Alan?
Yes, I'm very well, thank you. Good to get back together again on this.
Yes.
So last time we covered quite a bit of material, even though we were on the call for just 15 minutes. And we talked about everything from World Values Day to how people really go about putting their values into practice and how that's a focus for us as opposed to a more theoretical approach. And we also talked about some example stories, and you gave an outline of GVA. So it was a really good start to the conversation. Thank you. And today I was thinking there was a question that you prompted in me last time, because you said that the people that you meet often talk about how they would like to live in line with their values. And so at the end of the call, the question that I was left holding was, well, what gets in the way? So could we start with that?
Sure, sure. Well, this is a core question in life, right? But I think that there's a couple of different reasons that I see. One is that, in fact, we have conflicting values. There are things that we aspire to, and there's things that we want. And, some scholars talk about the should-want dichotomy. So we deal with our own internal conflicts, and that's one thing, and that's just a part of human nature. But then I think another piece that gets in the way, or that sometimes complicates the conversation, is that there's different kinds of values, right? There are moral values, the sort of core values, the aspirational values that philosophers refer to as hypernorms. This is a relatively short list of values that tend to be shared universally, things like compassion and fairness and justice. But then there's other kinds of values that aren't moral values. I value solitude. You like city, I like country. Those kinds of things. And so sometimes when we talk about values conversations, we confuse those. But I think the third reason, and the one that really I think gets to the heart of the work that I do, and I think that you do, is that sometimes we are pretty clear about what our values are, and we actually would like to act on them, but we aren't sure it's possible. We're either afraid, we're insecure, we feel we'll be punished, we feel we'll take a huge risk and we're not likely to be successful. We don't competent to do it. And that's where the work that I do with Giving Voice to Values comes in, because we're trying to give people the opportunity to rehearse, to pre-script, to peer coach, to recognize that they are not alone, and that some folks have been able to do this effectively, including themselves at certain points in their lives, and that we can get better at it with practice and rehearsal to create that kind of moral muscle memory that I talk about. So I that third reason is where we have some traction, or where we can get some traction.
Yeah, and I think that plays a lot to what I've heard people say about their use of the 31 practices approach and my 31 practices. So what people say is that they would like to do this stuff, but then because we live in a busy world, they actually don't consciously do it. And they just find that they're caught up in this busyness. And before you know it, you're not doing it, you haven't done it, and things have moved on. But do you think you're being too generous to people here, Mary? Do you think we try hard enough?
Well, I think that it depends on the individual. Some people try very hard. Some people don't try very much at all. But my sort of impetus here is, I think I don't want to expend my energy in places where I don't think I'm going to get much traction. And I don't think sorting people, between the good people and the bad people, or the ones who try and the ones who don't, that's not really where I want to expend my energy. I want to expend my energy with that group of people, who I think is a pretty large group, who would like to do this. I also feel that there are a lot of us who probably don't try very hard, partly because we just don't believe it's possible. And so I feel that if we give people the opportunity to rehearse and to look at examples of people who've done this effectively, we're starting to address that demotivator that may lead many of us not to try that hard or not to try in certain kinds of circumstances. So that's kind of where I'm placing my energy. So it's not to say that, people are so great. I mean, we're a mixed bag.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I don't want to overplay the word try, because it kind of automatically infers that it's hard work. But sometimes I think the reason we don't try is because there's that kind of support or framework or structure that we don't have, and therefore we don't try. And so if I tell you two stories about my 31 practice approach that really kind of explain why the whole thing works to me. I'd been to a meeting in London, and I'd been talking about the approach, and I had used the example of, if compassion was one of your values, you might choose a practice which is to proactively offer your help to a stranger, which would put into play your value of compassion. And after this meeting, I was walking through Victoria Station in London, and I was late for my next meeting. And there was an old lady on the concourse who opened her purse too fast, and the coins jumped out onto the floor. Now, thinking back, I don't really know why I noticed this, but perhaps it was something to do with the fact that that example of offering help to a stranger was front of my mind. And then when I noticed it, the other thing that happened was I couldn't continue my journey to the next meeting. I felt obliged to go and help this lady. And again, maybe it was because it was front of mind. So I helped pick up the money with her, and she was a real typical East London lady. And she said, "Oh, thanks, love. I can't afford to throw it away. I'm on a pension." And we had a nice short conversation. And then I walked away from that feeling great. So then, if you fast forward to a couple of weeks, I was on the underground in a rammed tube, really, really full. So everybody was standing up and jammed against the doors. And one of the passengers was leaving the train, and by accident, their rucksack caught the earphones of another passenger. Now, they weren't in, fortunately, but they still caught them and took the earphones off. But the person that had lost them was so squashed that they couldn't call after the other guy, couldn't say anything. Our eyes connected, and this guy just looked resigned. I've lost my earphones. The doors closed. I was standing right next to the door. But then the train didn't move, and the doors opened again. And again, I don't know why, but I looked down, and on the platform were the earphones. So I took a step off, picked up the earphones, stepped back on, and then reached across the carriage and gave them back to the guy, whose eyes just lit up. And we didn't say a word, but obviously he was delighted. And I think back and I think, if I hadn't practiced with that old lady, would there have been less of a chance that I would have noticed and taken action in this situation? And now I find that I am very easy just offering help to strangers because of that journey that I've had. So does that resonate with the work that you do?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, the research basis for the Giving Voice to Values pedagogy and approach is specific, is exactly what you just described. It's this idea of rehearsal, of practice, of creating new neural pathways, of reducing the friction, and building a sense of confidence, and really just the habit. We have more research about habit formation now, and so a lot of it is, in the first instance you gave, it was top of mind, but in the second instance you gave, it was more just, you're starting to build this kind of habit. And this was a case of sort of altruistic behavior. But in organizations and in businesses, for example, where I do a lot of my work, it may not be something so much specifically around altruistic behavior, but it may be something about just the habit of not going along with the path of least resistance. If it's not going to be the best service for your customer, if it involves cutting corners in terms of honest reporting, if it means not being entirely transparent in terms of some of the messaging that you're giving about your organization and its products and services. So, on the one hand, this practice can work in this altruistic way, but a lot I do is around getting into the habit of just doing the right thing, more in the service of ethical and responsible business practices.
Yeah. And then at another level, I guess the work that I do with organizations is even more kind of practical day-to-day stuff than maybe some of the work that you do. So for instance, I'm doing some work with a prison at the moment. So it will be Europe's largest prison. And it's very progressive, focused on rehabilitation. And in the prisons here, the top guy is called the governor. So that's the title of the role. And he had read our first book about the 31 practices in organizations, wanted to do it for his team of officers. But subsequently in the meetings, I was suggesting, well, is that really progressive, just doing it for the officers? What about other people that are involved? And initially I was referring to service partner employees. So if they outsourced health and fitness, for instance, why would you not involve these people? And so he said, well, yeah, that's a good idea. I hadn't thought of it. So I started to get a bit braver then. And so I found myself saying, but if you were being really progressive, do you know who you would involve? And he was like, well, what are you getting at here? And I said, well, what about the men, the guys that are in the prison? So anyway, he was very excited at this suggestion, and that is what we've done. So we've created the set of 31 practices based on the prison's values. And now the men that are staying there, together with all of the service staff, are mutually accountable for the 31 practices, which are directly connected to their values. Now, the reason I mention that is because one of the values is around embracing the Welsh culture and heritage, because it's in Wales. And so through this series of workshops, one of the practices that we came up with was we learn the Welsh language and greet each other. So bore da is Welsh for good morning. And that's what everybody says around the place now. And it's amazing how quickly that very simple practice is starting to embed. It got launched like 2 weeks ago. But already it's really starting to be a noticeable difference that people are saying bore da. And that it's just fantastic to witness.
That's great.